In the dying light of a world that had forgotten mercy, where strength was measured in fangs and fury, rather than the quiet courage of an open heart, Elara Thornwell knelt in the frost-kissed earth and made a choice that would reshape the very foundations of her kingdom. The abandoned pup trembling in her arms was nothing. A runt, a failure, the discarded remnant of a bloodline the world believed extinct. Like her, it bore the mark of the unwanted, the broken, the deemed unworthy. The villagers who had spent years grinding her spirit beneath the weight of their contempt now gathered in a circle of mockery, their laughter cutting through the mountain air like winter wind through bare branches. "Wolfless fool," they whispered, playing at mother to something that should have died with dignity. But as the last rays of sunlight painted the peaks crimson and gold, as ancient magic stirred in response to an act of pure compassion, Elara understood a truth that would echo through the ages. Sometimes the greatest power lies not in conquering others, but in refusing to abandon those who need us most. The pup's silver eyes met hers across the space of their shared brokenness, and in that moment, destiny rewrote itself around a girl who had never shifted, a creature who should not exist, and the love that would bind them both to a fate written in starlight and shadow. By dawn, the Alpha King himself would kneel before her. By nightfall, the kingdom would remember why the old magic had always chosen the broken-hearted as its guardians. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The frost-bitten wind carved through Millhaven like a blade, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of a harsh winter. Elara Thornwell pulled her threadbare cloak tighter around her shoulders as she made her way through the village square, her boots crunching against the thin layer of ice that had formed overnight. The other pack members gave her a wide berth, their conversations halting as she passed, replaced by pointed whispers and barely concealed sneers. "There goes the wolfless wonder," Marcus Greywind muttered to his companions, his voice deliberately loud enough for her to hear. Still pretending she belongs here. Elara kept her chin up, her gray eyes fixed straight ahead. 23 years of this treatment had taught her that responding only fed their cruelty. She was the daughter of a respected beta who had died defending the pack's borders when she was barely 5 years old. That should have meant something. It should have guaranteed her a place, a purpose, respect. But respect required a wolf, and Elara had never shifted. "Probably talking to the chickens again," Lydia Ashford laughed, her pack of followers giggling like a chorus of hyenas. "I heard she thinks they understand her. At least the chickens don't run away when they see her coming," another voice added. Elara's steps never faltered, though her hands clenched into fists beneath her cloak. She had learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged them. Instead, she focused on her destination, the forest edge where she collected herbs for the pack's healer. It was solitary work, perfect for someone like her, someone who didn't fit anywhere else. The ancient pines stood like silent sentinels as she crossed the threshold between civilization and wilderness. Here, away from judging eyes and cruel tongues, Elara could finally breathe. The forest had always been her sanctuary, the only place where her lack of a wolf form didn't matter. Animals didn't care about status or bloodlines. They responded to intention, to the gentleness in her touch and the patience in her movements. She was kneeling beside a patch of winter sage, her fingers working quickly to gather the precious herbs, when she heard it, a sound so faint it was almost lost in the whisper of wind through branches. A whimper, weak, desperate, and unmistakably young. Elara froze, her heart clenching. She knew that sound too well, the cry of something abandoned, something left to die alone. Rising slowly, she followed the plaintive noise deeper into the undergrowth, pushing aside thorny branches that snagged at her cloak. There, huddled beneath a fallen log, was the smallest wolf pup she had ever seen. Its fur was matted with mud and dried blood, its tiny body shaking with cold and fear. One of its legs was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. The pup's eyes, a startling silver that seemed to shimmer even in the dim forest light, fixed on her with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "Oh, little one," Elara whispered, her voice catching. She approached slowly, hands extended palm up in the universal gesture of peace. The pup tried to scramble backward, but only managed to press itself more firmly against the log, too weak to flee. Elara's heart shattered. She had found abandoned animals before, birds with broken wings, rabbits caught in traps, but never a wolf pup, never something so clearly marked for death by its own kind. The pack had strict rules about culling the weak, about maintaining the strength of the bloodline. This little creature had obviously been deemed unworthy and cast out to die. "You're the runt, aren't you?" she murmured, settling into a crouch just out of the pup's reach. "They decided you weren't worth keeping." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, because she understood. She understood what it meant to be judged insufficient, to be marked as defective by those who should have protected you. The pup's silver eyes never left her face, as if it somehow sensed her empathy. Slowly, carefully, Alara began to hum, a wordless melody her father used to sing when she was frightened. The pup's trembling gradually subsided, though it remained pressed against the log. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, she extended one hand toward the tiny creature. "I won't hurt you," she promised. "I know what it's like to be unwanted." The pup's nose twitched, scenting her. Whatever it detected must have reassured it, because it didn't flinch when her fingers finally made contact with its matted fur. Alara's touch was feather light, but even that gentle pressure made the pup whimper. "I know, sweet one. I know it hurts." She carefully scooped the injured creature into her arms, marveling at how light it was, all bones and fur with barely any meat on its frame. The pup was clearly starving, probably hadn't eaten in days. "But I've got you now. You're safe." The words were a promise she wasn't sure she could keep, but she meant them with every fiber of her being. This tiny, broken creature deserved a chance at life, deserved someone who would fight for it, even when no one else would. The walk back to Millhaven felt longer than usual, weighted down as she was with her precious cargo. The pup had fallen into an exhausted sleep against her chest, its breathing shallow but steady. Alara kept one hand protectively curved around its small form, while the other clutched her cloak closed against the bitter wind. She entered the village through a side path, hoping to avoid the main square where the other pack members gathered. Her small cottage sat on the outskirts of Millhaven, as far from the Alpha's grand house as geography would allow, a physical representation of her status in the hierarchy. But luck had never been her friend. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Marcus Greywind stepped out from behind a building, his lips curved in a cruel smile. His companions flanked him, wolves drawn by the scent of weakness. "The wolfless one thinks she's a mother now?" Alara clutched the pup closer to her chest, her protective instincts flaring. "Leave us alone, Marcus." "Oh, but I'm curious," he drawled, taking a step closer. His nostrils flared as he scented the air, and his expression shifted from amusement to disgust. "You brought home a runt, a broken, useless runt that some pack was smart enough to throw away." "It's just a baby," Alara said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "It's hurt and starving. It's weak," Marcus snarled, his eyes flashing with the inner fire of his wolf. "Weakness is a disease, Alara. It spreads. It contaminates everything it touches." More pack members had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Alara saw the same disgust on their faces, the same contempt that had followed her all her life. But this time, it wasn't directed only at her. It was aimed at the helpless creature in her arms. "Put it down," Lydia commanded, her voice sharp with authority she didn't actually possess. "Let it die as nature intended." "No." The word came out stronger than Alara had expected, ringing with a conviction that surprised even her. "I won't let you hurt it." Laughter erupted from the crowd, harsh, mocking sounds that cut through the evening air like glass. Marcus threw back his head and howled with amusement, the sound taken up by his followers until the entire group was cackling at her defiance. "Listen to her," someone called out. "The wolfless girl thinks she can protect something. What's she going to do, throw vegetables at us?" Another voice jeered. "Maybe she'll talk it to death with her animal speeches." The mockery washed over Alara like a tide, but she held her ground. The pup stirred in her arms, disturbed by the noise, and she instinctively tightened her hold. Whatever happened to her, she wouldn't let them harm this innocent creature. "You're pathetic," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a whip. "Wasting your time on something that should have died days ago. But then again, maybe you identify with it. Another broken, useless thing that doesn't belong anywhere." The words hit their mark, but instead of crumbling, Alara felt something harden inside her chest. She had spent years absorbing their cruelty, letting their words carve pieces from her soul. But not today. Not when she held something precious that depended on her strength. "At least I have compassion," she said quietly, but her voice carried in the sudden stillness. "At least I don't turn my back on those who need help." For a moment, the crowd fell silent, shocked by her boldness. Then Marcus's face darkened with rage. "Compassion is weakness," he growled, taking another step forward. "And weakness will get you killed." The threat hung in the air like a blade, but before anyone could act on it, a sound split the evening, a howl unlike anything Alara had ever heard. It was pure, wild, and heartbreakingly lonely, but beneath the grief, she detected something else. Power. Raw, ancient, and absolutely terrifying. The pup in her arms had awakened, its tiny muzzle pointed toward the darkening sky as it released that impossible sound. For something so small, the voice it carried was enormous, echoing off the surrounding mountains and seeming to shake the very foundations of the earth. The crowd stumbled backward, their mockery dying in their throats. Even Marcus's confident sneer faltered as the howl stretched on, rising and falling with heartbreaking melody. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound cut off. In the silence that followed, Alara could hear her own heart thundering. The pup looked up at her with those silver eyes, now bright with an intelligence that seemed far too old for such a young creature. Something had changed in that moment, something fundamental and irreversible. From the forest came an answering call, deep, resonant, and unmistakably dominant. Then another, and another. The very air seemed to vibrate with responding howls, as if every wolf within 100 miles had heard the pup's cry and was compelled to answer. But it was the last voice that made Alara's blood turn to ice in her veins. Powerful beyond measure, carrying notes of command that spoke to something primal in every shifter's soul. It was the voice of an alpha, not just any alpha, but one whose authority was absolute. The Alpha King had heard the call, and he was coming. The silence stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours. The pack members stood frozen in the village square, their earlier mockery replaced by a tension so thick it seemed to choke the very air from their lungs. Alara clutched the pup against her chest, feeling its tiny body tremble, whether from cold, exhaustion, or something deeper, she couldn't tell. Then the ground began to vibrate. It started as barely a whisper through the soles of their feet, so subtle that for a moment Alara thought she might be imagining it. But the vibration grew stronger, more insistent, until even the stones of the village square seemed to hum with anticipation. The rhythmic thunder of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the surrounding mountains, growing louder with each passing second. "Oh, gods," Marcus Greywind whispered, his face draining of all color. "What have you done?" But Alara barely heard him. Her attention was fixed entirely on the pup in her arms, whose silver eyes had taken on an otherworldly gleam. The tiny creature was no longer trembling with fear. Instead, it seemed to be vibrating with an energy that made the air around them crackle with unseen power. When it looked up at her, Alara saw something that made her breath catch. Recognition. As if this small, broken creature somehow knew exactly what was coming. The hoofbeats grew thunderous, accompanied now by the jingle of armor and the whispered rush of cloaks in the wind. Through the gap between two buildings at the far end of the square, Alara caught her first glimpse of them, riders emerging from the forest like shadows given form. They moved with a fluid precision that spoke of years training together, their dark horses seeming to float over the ground rather than gallop across it. At their head rode a figure that made every instinct in Alara's body scream both danger and submission simultaneously. Even from a distance, even in the gathering twilight, there was no mistaking the raw power that radiated from him like heat from a forge. This was the Alpha King, Kaelin Draven, the wolf who bows to none. The villagers began to drop to their knees, one by one, until only Alara remained standing in the center of the square. She wanted to kneel too. Every fiber of her being demanded she show proper submission to such overwhelming authority, but something about the pup in her arms kept her upright. It was as if the tiny creature was lending her strength, sharing some reserve of courage she hadn't known existed. The riders swept into the square like a storm made flesh, their horses dancing to a stop in perfect formation. Steam rose from the animals' flanks, their breath misting in the cold air as they snorted and pawed at the ground. But it was their rider that commanded every eye, every thought, every fearful breath. Kaelin Draven dismounted with the fluid grace of a predator, his boots hitting the cobblestones with barely a sound despite his impressive size. He was tall, taller than any man Alara had ever seen, with broad shoulders that spoke of both supernatural strength and the weight of absolute command. His dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that seemed carved from granite and determination. Sharp cheekbones caught the dying light, and his jaw was set with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. But it was his eyes that stole Ilara's breath entirely. Golden. Not the warm amber of autumn leaves, but the burning gold of a forge at its hottest, bright enough to seem like they generated their own light. They swept across the assembled villagers with casual dismissal, before fixing on her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. For a moment that lasted an eternity, neither of them moved. The Alpha King studied her with those impossible eyes, taking in her threadbare cloak, her defiant posture, and most importantly, the small bundle she held protectively against her chest. His nostrils flared slightly, scenting the air, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "You," he said, and his voice was everything the legends claimed. Deep, resonant, carrying notes of command that seemed to reverberate in the very bones of everyone present. "You're the one who answered the call." It wasn't a question, but Ilara found herself nodding anyway. I don't understand, Your Majesty." "What call?" A ghost of a smile crossed Kaelin's stern features. There and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. The call for protection, for sanctuary, for someone brave enough to shelter the abandoned. His golden gaze dropped to the pup in her arms. "Show me." Ilara's hands trembled as she carefully adjusted her hold on the tiny creature, turning it so that Kaelin could see its silver eyes and matted fur. The pup's broken leg was still twisted at that awful angle, and dried blood caked its small muzzle. To anyone else, it would look like exactly what the villagers had claimed, a worthless runt, too weak to survive. But the moment Kaelin's eyes fixed on the pup, everything changed. The Alpha King went perfectly still, so motionless he might have been carved from stone. The air around him seemed to thicken, charged with a power that made Ilara's skin prickle and her heart race. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something she couldn't quite identify. Reverence, maybe, or carefully controlled fury. "Do you know what you hold?" he asked quietly. Ilara looked down at the pup, which had fixed those eerily intelligent silver eyes on the Alpha King. There was something passing between them, some silent communication she couldn't understand. "A baby that needed help," she said simply. Kaelin's laugh was a sound like distant thunder. "A baby." He took a step closer, and the villagers around them pressed themselves even lower to the ground, as if trying to disappear entirely. "Tell me, girl, what is your name?" "Ilara Thornwell, Your Majesty." "Ilara Thornwell," he repeated, rolling the syllables around as if tasting them. "And you found this baby, abandoned in the forest?" "Yes, sir. Under a fallen log, injured and starving. Someone had left it to die." She lifted her chin, meeting his burning gaze despite every instinct that screamed at her to look away. "I couldn't just leave it there." Couldn't or wouldn't? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, Ilara could hear the rapid breathing of the kneeling villagers, could smell their fear like a tangible thing, but she refused to back down, refused to apologize for the choice that had led to this moment. "Both," she said firmly. It was wrong to abandon something helpless, something that had done nothing but be born different. This time, Kaelin's smile was real, sharp and dangerous, but undeniably genuine. He moved closer still, until she could feel the heat radiating from his powerful frame, could catch his scent of pine and steel, and something wild that made her wolf-starved soul ache with longing. "Born different," he murmured, his golden eyes never leaving her face. "Yes, I suppose that's one way to put it." He gestured to one of his guards, a stern-faced man with silver threading through his dark hair. "Commander Theron, please examine the creature Miss Thornwell has so graciously rescued." The commander dismounted with military precision and approached with careful, measured steps. Ilara tensed as he drew near, every protective instinct she possessed flaring to life. The pup sensed her distress and let out a tiny whimper, pressing closer to her chest. "Easy," Kaelin said, and though his voice was gentle, it carried the unmistakable weight of command. "No one here will harm what you protect. You have my word." There was something in his tone that made Ilara believe him, despite the impossibility of the situation. She forced herself to remain still as Commander Theron knelt beside her, his experienced hands moving with surprising gentleness as he examined the injured pup. "The markings are correct, Your Majesty," he said after a thorough inspection. "Silver eyes, the distinctive fur pattern along the spine, and—" he paused, lifting one of the pup's tiny paws to examine the pads. "The mark of the crescent moon." A collective gasp rose from the kneeling villagers, followed by excited whispers that were quickly hushed. Alara looked between the commander and the Alpha King, confusion written across her features. "What mark? What does it mean?" Kaelin studied her for a long moment, those golden eyes seeming to weigh her very soul. When he spoke, his voice carried the gravity of ancient truths and deadly secrets. "What you hold, Alara Thornwell, is not simply a wolf pup. It is the last surviving heir of the Shadowborn line, a bloodline thought extinct for over a century. This child is royalty of the highest order, descended from the very wolves who first learned to take human form." The words hit Alara like a physical blow. She looked down at the tiny broken creature in her arms, this seemingly worthless runt that her village had mocked her for saving. But it was abandoned, left to die. If it's so important, why would anyone? "Because," Kaelin interrupted, his voice darkening with barely contained fury, "there are those who believe the old bloodlines are too dangerous to survive, too powerful, too unpredictable." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. They would rather see the ancient magic die than risk it falling into the wrong hands. Understanding began to dawn, cold and terrible. Someone tried to kill it, on purpose. Someone succeeded in killing the rest of its family, Kaelin corrected grimly. Parents, siblings, guardians, all slaughtered in a coordinated attack 3 days ago. Only this one survived, and only because it was hidden away by a dying guardian who managed to carry it to safety before succumbing to its wounds. Alara's arms tightened protectively around the pup, her heart breaking at the thought of such deliberate cruelty. Who would do such a thing? Enemies of the crown. Rebels who believe that power should be measured only in physical strength and political maneuvering, not in the ancient bonds that connect us to our true nature. Kaelin's golden eyes blazed with inner fire. They fear what they cannot control, and they seek to destroy what they cannot understand. The pup stirred in her arms, lifting its silver head to look directly at the Alpha King. For a moment, the two stared at each other in perfect silence, and Alara could swear she felt something pass between them, recognition perhaps, or a meeting of minds that transcended the barrier of age and species. Then the impossible happened. Kaelin Draven, the most powerful alpha in the known world, the king who commanded the loyalty of a dozen packs and ruled an empire that stretched across 3 mountain ranges, slowly, deliberately, went down on one knee before a village girl and an orphaned pup. The gasps from the watching villagers were audible this time, sharp sounds of shock and disbelief that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Marcus Greywind's face was white as bone, his mouth hanging open in stunned silence. Even Commander Theron looked surprised, though he quickly schooled his features back to professional neutrality. "Your Majesty," Alara breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" Kaelin's golden eyes never left the pup's silver ones as he spoke. "I am showing proper respect to the rightful heir of the Shadowborn line." And his gaze shifted to meet Alara's, and the intensity there made her breath catch. "I am honoring the courage of the woman who risked everything to protect what others would have left to die." "I don't understand," Alara said, though her heart was racing with emotions she couldn't name. "I'm nobody special. I don't even have a wolf." "Don't you?" Kaelin asked quietly, and there was something in his voice that made her think he saw things others missed. "Tell me, Alara Thornwell, when you found this child, what did you feel?" The question caught her off guard. She looked down at the pup, remembering that moment in the forest when their eyes had first met. "I felt connected, like I understood its pain, its fear, like it was calling to something inside me that I didn't know existed." Kaelin nodded slowly. "The Shadowborn bloodline has always chosen its own guardians, not through politics or arranged marriages, but through bonds that run deeper than blood or pack loyalty. This child called to you across the forest because it recognized something in your spirit, something that made you worthy of its trust." "But I'm wolfless," Alara protested weakly. "Are you?" Kaelin rose to his full height, towering over her with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow felt protective instead. Or have you simply never had cause to discover what lies dormant within you? Before she could respond, the pup in her arms began to glow. It started as barely a shimmer, so faint it might have been a trick of the dying light. But the luminescence grew stronger, emanating from the tiny creature's silver fur, until it seemed to be wrapped in moonlight, made manifest. The glow pulsed gently, rhythmically, like a heartbeat made visible, and as it did, something inside Alara began to respond. She felt it first as a warmth in her chest, a sensation like coming home after a long, cold journey. The warmth spread outward through her limbs, filling spaces in her soul she hadn't realized were empty. Power flowed through her, not the raw, dominant strength of an alpha wolf, but something older and more subtle, something that spoke of protection and healing, of bonds forged in understanding rather than conquest. Around them, the very air seemed to shimmer with possibility. The villagers who had spent years mocking her weakness now stared in awe as Alara Thornwell, the girl they had dismissed as worthless and wolfless, stood bathed in the same ethereal light that surrounded the shadow-born air. "Impossible," Marcus breathed, his face slack with shock. "Not impossible," Kaelin corrected, his voice carrying a note of deep satisfaction. "Simply unexpected. The old bloodlines have their own ways of awakening, their own criteria for choosing who will serve as guardian and protector." The light gradually faded, leaving Alara feeling changed in ways she couldn't begin to understand. The pup in her arms looked up at her with those knowing silver eyes, and she realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. She was no longer just a girl who had rescued an abandoned animal. She was something more, something the ancient magic had deemed worthy. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Kaelin's smile was fierce and proud. "Now, Alara Thornwell, you and your charge come with me. There are those who would see this child dead, and they will not stop their pursuit simply because it has found a protector. You will both need training, the heir in controlling its growing power, and you in understanding your new role as its guardian. And if I refuse?" The question was asked more from curiosity than any real intention to decline. After what she had just experienced, after the connection she had felt with the pup, and the way her entire being seemed to sing in Kaelin's presence, Alara knew there was really only one choice she could make. "Then you would be condemning the last hope of the Shadowborn line to death," Kaelin said simply. "And I think we both know that's not something you could live with." He was right, of course. Alara looked down at the pup, at the heir she was apparently destined to protect, and felt the weight of responsibility settle across her shoulders like a mantle. It should have been crushing, should have sent her running back to her simple cottage and her quiet life of gathering herbs. Instead, it felt like coming alive for the first time. "Very well, Your Majesty," she said, lifting her chin with newfound determination. "I accept." The smile Kaelin gave her in return was radiant enough to rival the moon itself. And as he turned to address his men, preparing for their departure, Alara caught sight of the villagers still kneeling in the square. Their faces showed a mixture of awe, fear, and, in Marcus's case, a dawning realization that they had gravely underestimated the girl they had spent years tormenting. The mockery had ended. The real adventure was about to begin. The journey to Kaelin's stronghold took 3 days through mountain passes that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time, where ancient pines whispered secrets in languages older than civilization, and the very air hummed with residual magic from battles fought centuries before any living soul could remember. Alara rode beside the Alpha King on a gentle mare he had procured from the village, a beautiful creature with intelligent eyes and a coat like polished copper that seemed to understand the precious nature of her burden without being told. The Shadowborn pup, nestled securely in a specially crafted sling across her chest, its tiny form wrapped in furs so soft they must have come from creatures that existed only in legend. The carrier itself was a work of art, woven from materials that seemed to shift color depending on the light, now deep forest green, now midnight blue, now the silver of moonlight on water. Kaelin had commissioned it within hours of their departure from Millhaven, and watching him oversee its creation with meticulous care had been Alara's first real glimpse into the depths of his protective nature. The tiny creature had grown stronger during their travels, its broken leg mending with supernatural speed, thanks to careful ministrations from Master Aldrich, the royal healer who accompanied their party. The elderly man possessed hands that glowed with gentle warmth whenever he touched an injury, and his herb-scented pouches contained remedies that worked miracles. Under his expert care, the pup's matted fur had regained its lustrous shine, revealing intricate patterns of silver and white that seemed to form ancient symbols across its small body. What struck Alara most about the journey, however, wasn't the breathtaking scenery or the silent efficiency of Kaylin's elite guard. It was the way the Alpha King treated her. Not as a rescued peasant girl to be pitied, or a burden to be endured, but as an equal, whose opinions mattered, whose comfort was a priority, whose very presence seemed to bring him a peace she could see settling into his powerful shoulders whenever he looked at her. He rode beside her for hours, his massive war horse moving in perfect synchronization with her gentler mount, explaining the political intricacies that had led to the attack on the Shadowborn family, the ancient prophecies that spoke of their return, and the enemies who would stop at nothing to prevent that return from coming to pass. His voice was deep and resonant, carrying easily over the sound of hoofbeats and wind, and Alara found herself hanging on every word, not just because of the critical information he shared, but because she was rapidly becoming addicted to the sound of him speaking. The Shadowborn line has always been different from other werewolf bloodlines, he explained as they crested a ridge overlooking a vast valley dotted with crystalline lakes that reflected the afternoon sun like scattered diamonds. His golden eyes swept across the landscape with the automatic assessment of a man who had spent his life defending territory, but when they returned to her face, they warmed with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Where most of us gained our power through dominance and territorial control, they drew theirs from something deeper, a connection to the very essence of what it means to be both human and wolf. Alara's hand moved instinctively to where the pup rested against her heart, its tiny body warm through the soft fur lining of its carrier. During their travels, she had begun to sense things from the small creature. Not thoughts exactly, but impressions of comfort when she was near, distress when she moved too far away, and something that felt remarkably like contentment when she spoke to it in the soft tones she had once reserved for wounded animals in the forest. What kind of connection? How is it different from what other wolves experience? Most shifter magic is about transformation, taking one form or another, using that form's strengths to dominate or survive. But the Shadowborn were bridges, Kaylin continued, his expression growing distant as he drew on knowledge passed down through generations of his family. They could heal wounds that should have been fatal, commune with animals that had never taken human form, speak to the spirits of forests and mountains, and most importantly, his gaze fixed on her with laser focus, they could awaken dormant abilities in others who possessed the potential but lacked the catalyst. The implications of his words sent a shiver down Alara's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Is that what happened to me? When it glowed? When I felt that change coursing through my entire body like liquid fire? You felt your wolf stir for the first time, Kaylin confirmed, his voice dropping to a more intimate register that seemed meant for her ears alone. The Shadowborn magic recognized something in you that had been sleeping, waiting for the right catalyst to bring it to life. Not everyone has that potential, Alara. Perhaps one person in 100,000 carries the genetic markers that allow for such an awakening, and even then, it requires contact with active Shadowborn magic to manifest. But I'm 23 years old, she protested, confusion coloring her tone. If I had a wolf, shouldn't it have manifested during puberty like everyone else's? I've spent my entire adult life being mocked for being wolfless, being told I was defective and incomplete. Kaylin was quiet for so long that Alara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of certainty that brooked no argument, tinged with something that sounded suspiciously like personal experience. Not all wolves are meant to wake early, Alara. Some sleep until they're needed, until their purpose becomes clear and their destiny calls them forward. Guardian wolves are among the rarest of all our kind, perhaps 1 in 10,000, and they almost never manifest until they encounter the specific being they're meant to protect. He paused, his gaze dropping to the pup with an expression of wonder that transformed his stern features. This little one has been calling for you its entire short life, sending out magical signals that only your dormant guardian instincts could detect. That pull you felt in the forest, the compulsion to search deeper into the woods despite the approaching storm, that wasn't coincidence. The weight of revelation settled over Alara like a heavy cloak. Everything that had happened, every choice that had led her to that moment of discovery, had been guided by forces beyond her understanding. The attack that killed its family, Was that planned specifically to prevent this bonding from taking place? Kaylin's jaw tightened with barely suppressed fury, and for a moment, the temperature around them seemed to drop several degrees. Someone knew, or at least suspected. The enemies of the crown have seers among their ranks, individuals who can read the threads of fate and probability like others read books. They saw the potential for a guardian awakening, and moved to eliminate the catalyst before it could manifest. His hands clenched into fists around his reins, the leather creaking under the pressure. They succeeded in destroying an entire family line that had survived in secret for over a century. They failed only in preventing you from finding and bonding with the last survivor. The horror of it, the calculated cruelty required to murder children to prevent a magical awakening, made Alara's stomach turn. Someone knew about me specifically, about what I might become. Not specifically about you, no, but they knew someone with the proper bloodline markers lived in this region. Our intelligence suggests they've been systematically hunting potential guardians for years, killing anyone who might pose a threat to their long-term plans. Kaylin's expression darkened further. What they didn't account for was the strength of the bond between this particular heir and its chosen protector. The magic that connects you runs deeper than anything they could have predicted. As if summoned by their conversation about enemies and threats, a commotion erupted from the rear of their column. Urgent shouts mixed with the thunder of hoofbeats as riders approached at desperate speed, their horses lathered with sweat, and their faces grim with news that would shatter the peaceful atmosphere of their journey. Kaylin held up a hand, bringing their entire party to an immediate halt, his powerful body tensing with the predatory alertness of an apex predator scenting danger on the wind. "Your Majesty," the lead scout, a young man with dirt-streaked face, torn cloak, and a foam-flecked horse that had clearly been ridden to the limits of its endurance, reined up beside them with desperate urgency. Enemies approach from the South Pass. 24 riders at minimum, heavily armed and moving fast. They'll intercept our route within the hour. Alara's blood turned to ice in her veins, every protective instinct she had developed over the past 3 days screaming warnings. They've found us. So it would seem. Kaylin's transformation was instantaneous and absolutely terrifying to behold. Gone was the patient teacher who had spent days explaining ancient history and magical theory, the gentle protector who had ensured her comfort at every stop. In his place sat a warrior king, every line of his powerful frame radiating deadly purpose and barely contained violence. When he turned in his saddle to address his men, his voice carried the unmistakable ring of absolute command. "Commander Theron!" "Sir!" The grizzled veteran materialized beside them as if conjured from thin air, his scarred face set in grim lines that spoke of battles fought and won against impossible odds. "Take Miss Thornwell in the air to Shadowmere Keep by the northern route," Kaylin ordered, his golden eyes already scanning the surrounding terrain with tactical precision. "Use whatever force necessary to ensure their safety. Send outriders ahead with warning signals. I want full defensive measures activated before they arrive, and have Healer Morgan standing by with everything she might need." "Your Majesty," Alara interrupted, her voice coming out smaller than she intended, but still carrying the conviction she felt burning in her chest. "What about you? You can't face 24 enemies alone." The smile Kaylin gave her in response was fierce and absolutely confident, the expression of a predator who had never lost a fight and had no intention of starting now. "I won't be alone. Half my guard will remain with me, more than enough to handle whatever rabble thinks it can challenge the Alpha King in his own territory." He reached out to touch her cheek with surprising gentleness, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her jaw with reverent care. "Trust me, Alara. I've survived worse odds than this, and I have considerable motivation to return to you safely." The pup in her arms seemed to sense the tension radiating from both of them, beginning to whimper with distress that tugged at Alara's heart. Its silver eyes were fixed on Kaylin with an intensity that seemed too mature for such a young creature, and without warning, it let out a small howl, not the heartbreaking cry of abandonment they had heard in the village, but something else entirely, a sound of recognition, of acknowledgement, of absolute trust being placed in someone deemed worthy of it. Kaylin's eyes widened slightly at the sound, and Alara saw something shift in his expression, surprise giving way to wonder, then to something deeper and more profound. "Did it just accept you as family?" Alara finished, understanding flooding through her like warm honey. "It's claiming you as pack, as someone who belongs in its inner circle of protection." For a moment, that seemed to stretch into eternity, the Alpha King's carefully controlled mask slipped completely, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath the layers of power and authority. "I haven't had family in a very long time," he said quietly, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. "Not since my parents and younger sister were killed in the rebellion 15 years ago." "You do now," Alara replied without thinking, the words slipping out before she could stop them. But she didn't regret them. Couldn't regret them when she saw the way his golden eyes blazed with emotion at her simple declaration. Something had been building between them during their journey, a connection that went beyond mere attraction, or the circumstances that had brought them together. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, as if she was something precious he was afraid to lose, in the careful consideration he showed for her opinions, in the protective fury that blazed in his eyes whenever the conversation turned to their enemies. "Alara." His voice was thick with emotion, raw with things he wanted to say but couldn't find words for. But before he could continue, another urgent shout from their scouts shattered the moment like glass. "Contact! Hostile riders cresting the southern ridge. They're moving to cut off the pass." Commander Theron was already moving, his battle-trained mount dancing with barely restrained energy, while his hand dropped automatically to the pommel of his sword. "My lady, we must go. Now. The king's orders are clear." Alara wanted to protest, wanted to stay and fight beside the man who had shown her more respect and genuine care in 3 days than her own village had managed in 23 years. Every newly awakened instinct in her body screamed against leaving him to face danger alone, demanded she remain at his side, where she could help protect him as he had protected her and the heir. But the weight of responsibility around her neck, the tiny life that depended entirely on her protection, made the choice for her. "Be safe," she whispered to Kaelin, pouring every ounce of feeling she possessed into those 2 simple words. "Always am," he replied with a wolfish grin that was all confidence and deadly promise, though she caught the flicker of something deeper in his eyes. Determination, perhaps, or a vow being made. Then he was wheeling his massive warhorse away from her, barking orders to his remaining men as they prepared for battle with the smooth efficiency of warriors who had fought together for years. The last thing she saw before Commander Theron's escort whisked her away was Kaelin drawing his sword, a blade that seemed to drink in the afternoon sunlight and reflect it back as something fiercer and more dangerous. The weapon sang as it cleared its scabbard, a note of pure menace that made every horse in their party shy away from its edge. The ride to Shadowmere Keep became a blur of desperate speed and barely controlled terror that seemed to stretch on for hours. Commander Theron set a punishing pace along mountain paths that seemed designed more for mountain goats than horses, his small escort of 8 elite guards maintaining perfect formation, despite the treacherous terrain and the constant threat of pursuit. These were not the usual carved roads that connected major settlements, but ancient tracks known only to those with intimate knowledge of the mountains. Smugglers' routes and hunting paths that twisted through hidden valleys and across exposed ridges where one wrong step could send horse and rider plummeting into oblivion. Behind them, the sounds of battle echoed off the surrounding peaks like thunder rolling through stone canyons. The clash of steel on steel, the howls of shifted wolves engaging in primal combat, and most unnervingly, the deep rumble of magical power being unleashed without restraint. More than once, Alara felt the very ground beneath them shake with the force of whatever spells were being thrown around in the conflict behind them, and she had to fight the overwhelming urge to turn around, to somehow find a way back to the man who had become the center of her rapidly expanding world. "Don't look back," Theron ordered gruffly, when Alara's head began to turn toward the distant sounds of combat. His weathered face was set in grim lines, but she caught the flicker of concern that crossed his features when a particularly loud explosion echoed across the valleys. "The king's business is staying alive long enough to fight another day. Your business is protecting that child and getting it safely to the keep where it can begin learning to control its heritage." Easier said than done when every instinct in Alara's newly awakened wolf demanded she return to fight beside her. What exactly was Kaelin to her? The question had been haunting her thoughts for days now, growing more insistent with every meaningful look they shared, every moment of casual intimacy that felt as natural as breathing. Mate? The word carried implications that both thrilled and terrified her. King? That was certainly accurate, but it felt inadequate to describe the connection that had developed between them. The man who had changed everything about her understanding of herself and her place in the world? That came closer to the truth. but even that seemed insufficient to capture the depth of feeling that had taken root in her heart. The connection she felt to Kaelin was unlike anything she had experienced, or even imagined possible. Deeper than friendship, more primal than simple physical attraction, more profound than mere gratitude for his protection. It was as if their souls had recognized each other across the space of their first meeting, clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known was incomplete. When he looked at her with those burning golden eyes, she felt seen in a way that went beyond the physical, understood in a way that transcended words or explanations. The pup sensed her distress, with the uncanny awareness it had been displaying more frequently as their bond strengthened. It nuzzled against her chest with surprising strength for something so small, its tiny body radiating warmth and comfort that seemed to flow directly into her agitated heart. When she looked down, those silver eyes met hers with startling intelligence, and she could swear she saw understanding there, not the simple acknowledgement of an animal responding to human emotion, but genuine comprehension of her fears and an attempt to offer solace. "I know, little one," she murmured, one hand stroking the incredibly soft fur, while the other maintained her grip on the reins. "I'm worried about him too. He means something to both of us, doesn't he?" The pup's response was a soft whimper and a more insistent nuzzling, as if it was trying to communicate something important that she wasn't quite grasping. As the day wore on and their desperate flight continued, Alara began to notice that the small creature seemed to be growing stronger by the hour, not just physically, though its movements were becoming more coordinated and purposeful, but magically as well. The silver patterns in its fur had begun to shimmer with their own internal light, visible even in full daylight, and occasionally she caught glimpses of something ancient and powerful looking out through those impossibly intelligent eyes. Shadowmere Keep materialized out of the mountain mist, like something from a fever dream, or a tale told by firelight on winter nights. Built into the living rock of the peak itself, the fortress seemed to grow organically from the stone around it, its towers and walls blending seamlessly with the natural formations, in a way that made it difficult to tell where architecture ended and geology began. It was beautiful and terrible at once, elegant in its proportions, yet absolutely impregnable in its defenses, a stronghold worthy of the Alpha King who ruled from its halls and commanded the loyalty of dozens of packs across 3 mountain ranges. The structure rose in sweeping curves and dramatic angles that seemed to defy conventional engineering, with bridges spanning impossible gaps and towers that twisted toward the sky like the spires of some magnificent cathedral. Gardens cascaded down the mountainside in carefully planned terraces, their green abundance a sharp contrast to the harsh stone surroundings, while waterfalls channeled from hidden springs created a constant symphony of moving water that echoed through the complex like nature's own music. Magnificent, isn't it? Commander Theron slowed his horse to a more reasonable pace as they approached the massive gates, his gruff voice carrying a note of pride that spoke of years spent calling this place home. Kaelin's grandfather built the main structure 3 centuries ago, back when the old bloodline still walked openly among us, and magic was considered a tool to be celebrated rather than feared. They say the Shadowborn themselves helped with the construction, weaving protective magics into the very foundations that still guard against hostile magic and treacherous intent. The gates themselves were massive constructions of steel and spelled wood that seemed to pulse with their own internal power, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and reinforced with metals that gleamed like captured starlight. They swung open at their approach without any visible signal, operated by guards stationed in hidden alcoves whose presence was felt rather than seen. The mechanism moved with the silence of perfectly maintained engineering, and the weight of enchantments that had been layered into every joint and hinge over centuries of careful craftsmanship. Once inside the outer courtyard, Alara found herself surrounded by organized chaos as the fortress prepared for their king's return. Servants and soldiers moved with urgent purpose through spaces designed to accommodate hundreds of people, preparing defenses and making ready for whatever might follow in their wake. The architecture here was clearly designed with both beauty and function in mind. Every corridor had multiple branching paths to prevent bottlenecks during evacuation. Every open space could serve as a gathering point or defensive position, and every window provided both light and clear lines of sight for archers or magical attack. But it was the woman who approached them across the main courtyard that truly caught Alara's attention, and held it with the force of obvious authority and competence. Tall and elegant with silver-streaked hair that had been arranged in an elaborate knot, and eyes the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes, She moved with the confident grace of someone long accustomed to command and respect. Her clothing was practical rather than ornamental. Well-cut robes in deep blue that wouldn't impede movement, boots suitable for walking on stone floors, and gloves that suggested hands trained in both healing arts and more martial pursuits. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions and living with the consequences, tempered by genuine warmth that immediately put Alara at ease despite the strangeness of her circumstances. "I am Healer Morgan, Chief of the Royal Medical Staff and Keeper of the Old Knowledge," she said without preamble, her sharp gaze taking in every detail of Alara's appearance and the precious bundle she carried with the thoroughness of a trained observer. "His Majesty sent word ahead by Falcon. You and the heir are to be given every consideration and protection this keep can provide." She paused, her expression softening slightly, as she took in the signs of exhaustion and stress that Alara was trying unsuccessfully to hide. "How do you fare, child? The journey was not an easy one, I imagine, and the circumstances of your departure were somewhat more dramatic than one might prefer." "I'm fine," Alara began automatically, the response ingrained by years of deflecting concern from people who didn't really want to hear about her problems. But Morgan's raised eyebrow and knowing look suggested she wasn't fooled by the polite deflection for even a moment. "You've just experienced your first magical awakening, formed a guardian bond with a shadowborn heir thought extinct for over a century, and fled through hostile territory, while the man you're rapidly falling in love with stayed behind to fight overwhelming odds against enemies who want you and your charge dead," the healer said dryly, her tone suggesting she was stating obvious facts rather than making assumptions. "I rather doubt you're fine by any reasonable definition of the word. Exhausted, overwhelmed, terrified for someone else's safety, and probably dealing with magical feedback from a bond that's still stabilizing would be closer to accurate, wouldn't it?" Alara's cheeks burned with embarrassment at having her feelings and condition laid out so bluntly by someone she had just met. But before she could protest or attempt to deflect again, Morgan was continuing with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with patients who tried to downplay their symptoms. "No matter. We'll sort you out properly once we've tended to more immediate concerns and ensured you're both settled safely." She gestured toward the pup with hands that had begun to glow with soft, golden healing light. "May I examine the little one?" His Majesty's message mentioned injuries sustained during the attack on its family, and I want to ensure everything has healed properly before we begin discussing the more complex aspects of its care and training. Reluctantly, fighting against every protective instinct that had developed over the past few days, Alara lifted the tiny creature from its specially crafted carrier. The pup's leg had been steadily improving during their journey thanks to Master Aldrich's expert care, but she could still detect slight stiffness in its movement that suggested lingering discomfort. Under Morgan's expert ministrations, however, even those last traces of injury faded away like morning mist before sunlight. More importantly, the healing seemed to awaken something deeper in the young heir. Its silver eyes grew brighter and more alert, taking on a luminous quality that spoke of power beginning to stir. When it looked around the courtyard with its newly sharpened senses, there was a regal bearing to its small head that hadn't been there before, an awareness and dignity that transformed it from a rescued animal into something altogether more significant. "Excellent," Morgan murmured, running gentle fingers through the pup's fur with the reverence one might show to a priceless artifact. "The bloodline is incredibly strong in this one, stronger than anything we might have dared hope for. Given proper training and protection, it will grow into its full power admirably and become everything the prophecies suggested." She looked up at Alara with approval. "The bond between you is already remarkably well established. Most guardian pairs require weeks or even months to achieve this level of synchronization." "What kind of training?" Alara asked, curiosity overriding her exhaustion. "What does a shadowborn heir need to learn that other wolves don't?" Morgan's smile was mysterious and slightly unsettling, holding secrets that stretched back through centuries of carefully preserved knowledge. "The same kind you'll need, my dear. The shadowborn gifts don't manifest automatically or without guidance. They require careful cultivation, expert instruction, and most importantly, practice in a safe environment where mistakes won't result in catastrophic consequences." She gestured toward the keep's main entrance with obvious pride. "Fortunately, you've come to exactly the right place for such education. His Majesty has maintained the most extensive libraries on the old bloodlines anywhere in the known world, and I myself had the rare privilege of studying under one of the last properly trained Shadowborn healers before the bloodline was thought extinct. As they were ushered through corridors that spoke of ancient wealth and power accumulated over generations of successful rule, Alara found herself increasingly overwhelmed by the sheer scope and grandeur of her new surroundings. Tapestries depicting great battles and legendary wolves covered walls built from stones that had been fitted together with mathematical precision, while weapons and artifacts from dozens of conquered territories created displays that told the story of the Alpha King's expanding dominion. Everywhere she looked, the scent of old magic lingered like incense in the air, speaking of centuries of accumulated power and knowledge. Her assigned chambers were larger than her entire cottage had been, with a massive 4-poster bed that could have slept 6 people comfortably, a writing desk positioned perfectly to catch the mountain light streaming through tall windows, and a sitting area arranged around a fireplace large enough to roast an entire deer. Rich carpets covered floors made from polished stone, while the walls held paintings and mirrors that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. "Rest," Morgan ordered, though her tone remained kindly despite the firmness of the command. "Eat something substantial. The kitchen staff has been instructed to provide whatever you might need or desire. Let the little one sleep properly for the first time in its short life." She paused at the doorway, her storm-gray eyes growing serious as they fixed on Alara's face. "And try not to worry over much about our king. Kalen has survived far worse odds than anything he faces today, and he has considerable motivation to return safely to those who wait for him here." Alone for the first time in what felt like weeks, Alara found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of everything that had changed in such a short span of time. A week ago, she had been the village outcast, mocked and dismissed by everyone around her, living a life of quiet desperation and resigned loneliness. Now she was the guardian of a Shadowborn heir, her own dormant wolf beginning to stir with power she didn't understand, and somehow bound to the most powerful alpha in the known world by ties that grew stronger every hour they were apart. The pup. She really needed to think of a proper name for it, something that honored its heritage and the magnitude of what it represented, had curled up contentedly on a silk cushion near the fireplace, finally able to sleep deeply without the constant threat of danger. As she watched its tiny sides rise and fall with steady breathing, Alara felt the guardian bond singing in her blood like music she had never heard, but somehow knew by heart. This small creature was hers to protect, and she would die before letting anyone harm a single hair on its head. But it was the other bond, the one that pulled her thoughts constantly toward golden eyes and a warrior's smile, that truly frightened her with its intensity and implications. She had never been in love before, had never experienced anything approaching the depth of connection that seemed to exist between herself and Kalen. Every moment he stayed away fighting their enemies felt like a small eternity filled with worry and longing. Every distant sound made her heart race with hope that he had returned victorious and whole. The carved wooden box Commander Theron had given her sat on the writing desk where she had placed it upon arriving, its intricate symbols seeming to shift and dance whenever she glanced in its direction. Whatever it contained, she could feel the warm pulse of magic emanating from within, calling to something deep in her newly awakened soul. Kalen had said she would know when the time was right to open it, but for now, patience felt like the appropriate choice. As evening shadows began to lengthen across her chambers, a soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting perhaps one of the servants with food or news of the battle's outcome. Instead, Commander Theron stepped inside, his grizzled face bearing an expression of unmistakable relief, mixed with something that might have been paternal pride. Behind him came a younger soldier carrying a tray laden with food that smelled absolutely heavenly after days of travel rations. "The king returns," Theron announced without preamble, and Alara felt her heart leap with joy so intense it was almost painful. Victorious and unharmed, though he and his men are somewhat worse for wear. The enemy force has been destroyed, some captured for questioning, the rest scattered to the four winds or feeding the carrion birds. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she had to sit down on the edge of the bed to keep from swaying. "He's truly safe? Uninjured?" "Safe as houses, and itching to see you again," Theron confirmed with a gruff chuckle, though Healer Morgan has insisted he submit to a full examination and a proper meal before he's allowed to visit. Something about making sure his dramatic heroics haven't addled his brain more than usual, I believe were her exact words. The thought of seeing Kalen again, of confirming with her own eyes that he had survived the battle unscathed, sent warmth spreading through Alara's entire body. But there were questions that needed answers, concerns that had been growing during the long hours of their separation. The enemies who attacked, she began carefully. Did they learn anything about who was behind it? About why they want the heir dead so badly? Theron's expression darkened, and she saw his hand move unconsciously to rest on his sword hilt. We learned some things. Enough to know that this threat runs deeper than any of us suspected, and that there will be more attempts. He met her eyes with grim honesty. This was just the beginning, my lady. The real war is yet to come. The words should have terrified her, should have made her want to flee this place, and find somewhere safe to hide with her precious charge. Instead, Alara felt something fierce and determined stirring in her chest, the awakening guardian's instincts that would rather face any danger than abandon those under her protection. Then we'll be ready, she said quietly, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Theron's answering smile was fierce with approval. Spoken like a true guardian, His Majesty chose well when he recognized what you could become. After the commander left, Alara settled into the comfortable chair beside the fireplace, watching the sleeping pup while she waited for Kaelin's return. Outside her windows, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky like scattered diamonds against velvet, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sounds of celebration as word of their king's victory spread throughout the keep. But it was the single, powerful howl that rose above all other sounds, a voice filled with the pure joy of homecoming and the triumph of battles won, that made her newly awakened wolf stir in response, recognizing the call of its chosen alpha and answering with a harmony she hadn't known she possessed. When her door opened an hour later, and Kaelin stepped inside, still wearing his battle-stained armor but with those golden eyes blazing with relief and something deeper, Alara finally understood the true meaning of belonging. "My guardian," he said simply, and in those two words, she heard all the love and promise of the future they would build together. The mockery was truly over. Her real life was just beginning. 5 years had passed since that fateful night in Millhaven, when Alara first sheltered a broken pup from the storm, and the transformation of both guardian and heir had exceeded even the most optimistic prophecies. The shadow-born heir, now named Lunara, after the silver moonlight that had guided their first meeting, had grown into a magnificent young wolf whose mastery of the ancient magics rivaled that of her ancestors. Under Alara's devoted guidance and the expert tutelage of Shadowmere Keep's scholars, she had learned to heal wounds that should have been fatal, commune with the very spirits of the mountains, and most remarkably, awaken dormant abilities in others who carried the potential for greatness. The pack that had once mocked Alara's compassion now sent their own children to study under the legendary guardian in her charge, understanding at last that strength came in many forms. Alara herself had blossomed into a power that few could have imagined existed within the quiet village outcast. Her wolf, when it finally manifested fully during Lunara's second winter, proved to be unlike any seen in living memory, silver-white like captured starlight, with eyes that held depths of wisdom and compassion that could gentle the most savage beast or inspire courage in the most frightened soul. As Lunara's primary guardian and Kaelin's acknowledged mate, she had become a bridge between the old ways and the new, teaching others that true leadership meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and that the greatest victories were often won through understanding rather than conquest. The very villagers who had once scorned her now spoke her name with reverence, and visiting dignitaries from distant territories sought audiences just to witness the legendary bond between Guardian and Shadowborn. King Kaelin ruled with a wisdom tempered by love and a strength softened by compassion, his reign marking the beginning of a golden age, where the old bloodlines walked openly once more, and magic was celebrated rather than feared. The enemies who had sought to destroy the Shadowborn legacy had been systematically defeated, their rebellion crushed not just by superior force, but by the undeniable proof that the ancient ways brought healing rather than harm to the world. At his side stood Alara, no longer the wolfless girl who had been dismissed as worthless, but Queen Alara Draven, whose very presence reminded all who saw her that destiny often came disguised as the least likely candidates. Together, they had rebuilt not just a kingdom, but an entirely new understanding of what it meant to be truly strong. On quiet evenings when their duties were done, and the great halls of Shadowmere Keep settled into peaceful slumber, the three of them, king, queen, and the heir who was daughter to them both in every way that mattered, would walk the moonlit gardens together. Lunara, now nearly as tall as Alara's shoulder, and radiating power that made the very flowers bloom brighter in her presence, would chase fireflies through the terraced pathways, while her guardians watched with hearts full of wonder at how perfectly their broken pieces had fitted together to create something beautiful. And sometimes, when the moon was particularly bright, and the mountain air carried the scent of growing things, they would remember that it had all begun with a single act of compassion, one woman's refusal to turn away from suffering, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The mockery that had once defined Alara's life had become the foundation of a legend that would be told for generations, proof eternal that the greatest magic of all was simply choosing to care. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.